Hi all, today we'll discuss Java with Spring Boot AWS interview questions. So what all are the common interview questions with that? So most of the company will ask this. So mostly we will cover here top 50 Spring Boot AWS Kafka real-time interview questions answers for 2024. So the first question is what is a Spring Boot? How do we configure a Spring Boot application? What is a Spring Boot starter? Explain the concept of auto configuration in a Spring Boot. What is a Spring Boot actuators? How we will secure our application in a Spring Boot? How does a Spring Boot handle data migration? And what is the use of a Spring Boot application annotation? What is a Spring Boot starter? And how do you profile a Spring Boot application? So these all are the Spring Boot related common questions. Now coming for the AWS, if you have a requirement with the Java with Spring Boot, AWS Kafka requirement, then the interviewer will ask this type of questions. What is AWS? Explain the EC2 services. And what is S3 in AWS? What all are the Lambda? So what is Lambda in AWS? How does AWS RDS differ from DynamoDB? And what is Cloud Formation? What are the AWS VPC? Can you explain this AWS IAM service? What is this and how to use? And what is the AWS security group? What are the purpose of AWS CloudWatch? So these all are related for AWS services. Now coming for the Kafka, they will ask what is Kafka, explain the architecture of Kafka, like consumer, producers, brokers, topics, partitions, and zookeepers. Then what is topic? How does Kafka ensure the data durability? And what is the Kafka partitions? Explain the role of Kafka, zookeepers in Kafka. So, what is the use of zookeepers in Kafka? What does Kafka handle message ordering? What is the Kafka consumer group? How does Kafka handle fault tolerance? What are Kafka stream? So these all related for the Kafka. Now coming for the Spring Boot with Kafka. So if you are going for this requirement of a Spring Boot with Kafka, so the interviewer will ask this type of questions. How do you integrate Kafka with a Spring Boot? What is Kafka template in a Spring Boot? Explain Kafka listener in a Spring Boot. And how do you configure Kafka in a Spring Boot application? And what is a Kafka transaction manager in a Spring Boot application? How do you handle Kafka messaging serialization in Spring Boot? Explain the concept of Kafka consumer rebalanced and what is the purpose of Kafka admin in Spring Boot? How do you ensure message order in Kafka in Spring Boot? And what is the Kafka stream in Spring Boot? Now coming for the Spring Boot with AWS, if you are going for the Spring Boot with AWS requirement, so the interviewer will ask these questions. How do you deploy the Spring Boot application in AWS? What is a Spring Cloud AWS? How do you configure AWS credentials in a Spring Boot application? Explain the use of AWS S3 in a Spring Boot application. And how do you use AWS RDS in a Spring Boot application? Explain the AWS Lambda used in a Spring Boot. How do you manage AWS Secret in a Spring Boot application? What is the role of AWS Cloud Formations in deploying a Spring Boot application? How do you handle scalability in a Spring Boot application deployed on AWS? And the next last question is how do you use the Amazon SNS in a Spring Boot application? So if you are going for this Kafka Java with a Spring Boot AWS requirement, so interviewer will ask this type of question. If you are going with this Java with Kafka requirement, then interviewer will ask this type of question. If you have combination with Java, AWS, Kafka, and all, Spring Boot, Kafka, and all. So these type of the common interview questions. So we collected here top 50 common interview questions for this Spring Boot with AWS and Kafka real time interview questions. So just you take the reference and then go through this. Yeah. Thank you.